I never thought I'd end up here of all places. A lighthouse keeper. Me, the guy who used to work in a cubicle, staring at spreadsheets all day, is now standing on the edge of a cliff, staring at the endless expanse of the ocean. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to escape the noise of the city and the monotony of my old life. But as I stood there, the wind whipping around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake. The lighthouse was old, ancient even. It had been standing on this rocky outcrop for over a century, guiding ships through the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. The previous keeper, an old man named Harold, had retired after 30 years of service. He'd handed me the keys with a shaky hand and a look in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. Was it pity? Fear? I didn't know, and I didn't ask. I was too eager to start my new life. The first few days were uneventful. I familiarized myself with the lighthouse, learning how to operate the light and the foghorn. The solitude was refreshing at first. No emails, no meetings, no traffic. Just me, the ocean, and the occasional seagull. But as the days turned into nights, I began to notice things. Strange things. It started with the radio. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., the static would crackle to life. At first, I thought it was just interference, maybe from a passing ship. But then I started to hear voices. Faint, distorted voices whispering words I couldn't quite make out. I'd turn the volume up, straining to hear, but the voices would always fade away before I could understand them. Then there were the lights. Not the lighthouse beam, but other lights, out on the water, in the distance. They'd appear suddenly, flickering like fireflies, then vanish just as quickly. I tried to convince myself they were fishing boats or buoys, but deep down, I knew they weren't. They moved in ways that defied logic, darting across the water with impossible speed. The final straw came on the fourth night. I was in the lantern room, checking the light, when I heard a knock on the door. Not the main door at the base of the lighthouse, but the door to the lantern room itself. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way anyone could be up here with me. I was alone, completely alone. I froze, my hand hovering over the light switch. The knock came again, louder this time. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The door was closed, but I could see the shadow of someone or something on the other side. It was tall, too tall to be human, and its shape was wrong, distorted, like it was made of smoke. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the sound of the wind howling outside. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking, but before I could turn it, the shadow disappeared. I yanked the door open, but there was nothing there. Just the empty staircase spiraling down into darkness. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the lantern room, clutching a flashlight like a weapon. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak of the stairs, every gust of wind made me jump. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let some strange noises and shadows scare me off. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. The radio static grew louder, the voices more insistent. The lights on the water grew brighter, closer, and the shadow kept coming back. It would appear at the same time every night, knocking on the door, waiting for me to answer. I tried to rationalize it all, to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. By the end of the first week, I was a wreck. The lack of sleep was catching up to me, and the constant unease was gnawing at my sanity. I had to do something. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at every sound, questioning every shadow. So I decided to dig deeper. If there was something strange happening at this lighthouse, I needed to know what it was. I started by going through Harold's old records. He'd left behind a stack of journals filled with notes from his years as the keeper. Most of it was mundane: weather reports, maintenance logs, the occasional musing about the sea. But then I found it. A single sheet of paper tucked between the pages of one of the journals. It was a list of rules, handwritten in shaky cursive. The title at the top read, "Rules for the Keeper." I read them over and over, my stomach sinking with each line. 1. Never turn off the lighthouse beam between midnight and 3 a.m. The light must remain on at all costs during these hours. If it goes out, relight it immediately. 2. Do not answer the radio between 2:17 a.m. and 2:34 a.m. No matter what you hear, do not respond. The voices are not for you. 3. If you see lights on the water, do not shine the beam on them. They are not ships. They are not buoys. Do not acknowledge them. 4. If you hear knocking on the lantern room door, do not open it. No matter how loud it gets, do not open the door until sunrise. 5. If the shadow appears, cover the windows and wait. Do not look at it. Do not speak to it. Wait until it leaves. 6. If the foghorn sounds on its own, leave the lighthouse immediately. Do not return until the next morning. I stared at the list, my hands trembling. This wasn't a joke. Harold had written these rules with a sense of urgency, as if his life depended on them. And now, mine did too. That night, I followed the rules to the letter. I made sure the lighthouse beam was on, bright and steady. I ignored the radio when it crackled to life at 2:17 a.m., even though the voices were louder than ever, almost pleading. I didn't shine the beam on the lights I saw flickering in the distance. And when the shadow appeared, knocking on the lantern room door, I covered the windows and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. It worked. The shadow left without incident, and I made it through the night without any major scares. But the relief was short-lived. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratches. Deep, jagged scratches on the outside of the lantern room door. They hadn't been there before. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough edges. Whatever had been knocking on that door wasn't just a shadow. It was real, and it was getting stronger. I spent the day reinforcing the door, adding extra locks and a heavy metal bar across it. I didn't know if it would help, but I had to try. I couldn't just sit back and wait for whatever was out there to break in. That night, I followed the rules again. The radio static came and went, the lights flickered on the water, and the shadow knocked on the door. But this time, something was different. The knocking was louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a knock anymore. It was a pounding, like something was trying to break through. I covered the windows and waited, clutching the metal bar like a lifeline. The pounding continued for what felt like hours, each blow shaking the door on its hinges. But eventually, it stopped. The shadow was gone. I thought I was safe. I thought I'd made it through another night. But then I heard it. The foghorn. It sounded on its own, a deep, mournful blast that echoed across the water. My heart stopped. Rule number 6 flashed in my mind. If the foghorn sounds on its own, leave the lighthouse immediately. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my coat and ran down the spiral staircase, my footsteps echoing in the empty lighthouse. I burst through the front door and into the cold night air. The fog was thick, swallowing the beam of my flashlight as I stumbled down the rocky path toward the shore. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from the lighthouse. I made it to the boathouse, a small, dilapidated structure at the edge of the water. I barricaded myself inside, using an old wooden bench to block the door. I sat there in the dark, listening to the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. The foghorn sounded again, louder this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was out there. Something was coming. The foghorn blared again, its mournful sound cutting through the night like a warning. I sat in the boathouse, my back pressed against the wall, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The air was thick with moisture, and the fog outside seemed to press against the windows, as if trying to get in. I could barely see a foot in front of me, but I didn't dare turn on the light. Whatever was out there, I didn't want it to know where I was. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to the sound of the waves and the occasional blast of the foghorn. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second feeling like an eternity. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The rules, the shadow, the lights on the water. It was all connected, but I couldn't figure out how. All I knew was that I was in way over my head. Eventually, the foghorn stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. It was too quiet, too still. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound, any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the faint lapping of the waves against the shore. I waited a few more minutes, then cautiously got to my feet. My legs were stiff from sitting in the same position for so long, and I stumbled as I made my way to the door. I peered out the window, but the fog was too thick to see anything. I had no choice but to go back to the lighthouse. I couldn't stay in the boathouse forever. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The fog was so dense that I could barely see my own feet. I moved slowly, feeling my way along the rocky path, the beam of my flashlight barely piercing the gloom. Every sound made me jump, the crunch of gravel under my boots, the distant cry of a seabird. I was hyper-aware of every little noise, every shift in the air. I made it back to the lighthouse without incident, but the sense of dread only grew as I climbed the spiral staircase. The place felt different, colder, darker. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist in ways they hadn't before, and the air was heavy with a strange, metallic smell. I reached the lantern room and checked the light. It was still on, bright and steady, just as I'd left it. But something felt off. I sat down in the chair by the window, my eyes scanning the horizon. The fog was still thick, but I could see the faint glow of the lighthouse beam cutting through it. And then I saw them. The lights. They were back, flickering on the water, closer than ever before. My heart raced as I watched them, their movements erratic and unnatural. They weren't ships, they weren't buoys, they were something else entirely. I remembered the rules, do not shine the beam on them. But I couldn't help myself. I had to know what they were. I adjusted the light, directing it toward the closest cluster of lights. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the lights began to move, darting away from the beam like startled fish. But they didn't disappear. Instead, they started to converge, forming a single, bright point of light. I watched in horror as the light grew larger and brighter until it was almost blinding. And then, it started to move. Toward me. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The light was coming straight for the lighthouse, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't turn off the beam, that was against the rules, but I couldn't just stand there and let it come. I grabbed the metal bar I'd used to reinforce the door and held it like a weapon. The light was almost at the base of the lighthouse now, its glow so intense that it lit up the entire room. I could feel the heat radiating from it, even through the glass. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The light hovered there, just outside the window, pulsating like a living thing. I could see shapes within it, dark, shifting forms that seemed to writhe and twist. They were trying to take shape, to become something solid, but they couldn't quite manage it. And then, I heard it. A voice. Not from the radio, but from the light itself. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second.
"Let us in.
it said, the words echoing in my mind.
Let us in."
I backed away, my hands trembling. The voice was everywhere, filling the room, filling my head. It was pleading, desperate, but there was something else beneath it, something dark and hungry. I knew I couldn't let it in. Whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't even alive, not in the way I understood life. I covered my ears, but the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost a scream.
"Let us in. Let us in."
I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it directly at the light outside the window. The beam cut through the glow, and for a moment, the voice stopped. The light flickered, then began to fade, the shapes within it dissolving into nothingness. And then, it was gone. I sank to the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the flashlight. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't safe here. Not anymore. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed in the lantern room, too afraid to move, too afraid to sleep. The light outside had vanished, but the voice still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of what I'd just witnessed. I kept the lighthouse beam on, its steady glow my only comfort in the oppressive darkness. The fog had lifted slightly, but the ocean was still shrouded in an eerie stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. By dawn, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. My eyes burnt from lack of sleep, and my body ached from the tension of the night. But I couldn't rest. Not yet. I had to figure out what was happening. I had to understand the rules, the lights, the shadow, everything. If I didn't, I wasn't going to survive another night. I spent the morning going through Harold's journals again, searching for any clue I might have missed. Most of it was the same: weather reports, maintenance logs, the occasional note about a passing ship. But then I found something. A single entry, dated just a few weeks before Harold retired. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, and the words sent a chill down my spine. "It's getting worse. The lights are closer now, and the shadow, it's stronger. I don't know how much longer I can hold it off. The rules are the only thing keeping me alive, but even they might not be enough. If you're reading this, new keeper, listen carefully. There's more to this place than you know. The lighthouse isn't just a beacon for ships. It's a barrier, a prison. And if the light goes out, even for a second, they'll get in. And once they're in, there's no stopping them." I read the entry over and over, my hands trembling. A barrier? A prison? What was Harold talking about? And who, or what, were they? The questions swirled in my mind, but there were no answers. Just more fear, more uncertainty. I decided to call the Coast Guard. Maybe they could help. Maybe they knew something about the lighthouse that I didn't. But when I picked up the phone, there was no dial tone, just static. I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. I was cut off from the outside world, completely alone. As the day wore on, the sense of dread grew heavier. The lighthouse felt different, colder, darker. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist in ways they hadn't before, and the air was thick with a strange metallic smell. I tried to distract myself by checking the equipment, but my mind kept wandering back to the rules, the lights, and the voice. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bad. By nightfall, I was a nervous wreck. I double-checked the lighthouse beam, made sure the door was reinforced, and prepared myself for whatever might come. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. The radio crackled to life at exactly 2:17 a.m., just like it had every night. The static was louder this time, almost deafening, and the voices, they were clearer. I could make out words now, fragments of sentences.
"Help us. Let us in. We're trapped."
I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to respond. Rule number 2. Do not answer the radio between 2:17 a.m. and 2:34 a.m. But the voices were so desperate, so human. What if someone was really out there in trouble? What if I was ignoring a cry for help? The static grew louder, the voices more insistent.
Please, we need you. Let us in.
I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button. Hello? Who is this? What do you want? The static stopped. For a moment, there was silence. And then a voice came through clear and cold.
You shouldn't have done that.
The radio went dead. I stared at it, my heart pounding. I'd broken the rules. I'd answered the radio. And now, something was coming. I heard it before I saw it, a low, guttural growl coming from outside the lighthouse. I ran to the window and looked out, but the fog was too thick to see anything. The growl grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the door. And then, the knocking started. It wasn't like before. This wasn't a polite knock or even an insistent pounding. This was something else entirely. It was violent, brutal, like something was trying to tear the door down. The whole lighthouse shook with each blow, the walls groaning under the strain. I backed away, my hands trembling. The metal bar I'd used to reinforce the door was bending, the wood splintering. Whatever was out there, it was stronger than anything I'd faced before, and it wasn't going to stop. I grabbed the flare gun from the emergency kit and loaded it, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely hold it. The door was buckling now, the hinges creaking under the pressure. I aimed the flare gun at the door, ready to fire, but then I remembered the rules. Rule number 6. If the foghorn sounds on its own, leave the lighthouse immediately. The foghorn sounded, a deep, mournful blast that echoed across the water. I froze, torn between the rules and the thing trying to break down the door. But I didn't have time to think. The door exploded inward, shattering into pieces. And then, I saw it. The shadow. It was taller than before, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. But it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had eyes, glowing, malevolent eyes that burnt with a cold, inhuman light. And it was coming for me. I fired the flare gun. The flare shot through the shadow, but it didn't stop. It kept coming, its eyes fixed on me. I backed away, my heart pounding, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. And then, the lighthouse beam went out. The moment the lighthouse beam went out, the world seemed to collapse into chaos. The shadow surged forward, its form solidifying into something monstrous. A towering figure of darkness with glowing eyes and jagged, claw-like hands. The air grew colder, and the metallic smell intensified, making it hard to breathe. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. The rules had failed. The barrier was broken. And now, whatever was out there was coming for me. I fired the flare gun again, but the shadow didn't even flinch. It kept advancing, its eyes locked on me, its claws reaching out. I scrambled to the corner of the lantern room, my back pressed against the wall. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I was trapped. And then I remembered Harold's journal, the last entry. The lighthouse isn't just a beacon for ships, it's a barrier, a prison. If the light was the barrier, then maybe I could fix it. Maybe I could turn it back on. I lunged for the control panel, my hands fumbling with the switches. The shadow was almost on me now, its claws inches from my face. I could feel the cold radiating off it, a bone-chilling cold that made my skin crawl. I flipped the switch, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud hum, the lighthouse beam flickered back to life. The shadow let out a deafening roar, its form wavering as the light hit it. It stumbled back, its claws slashing at the air, but it couldn't withstand the beam. The light seemed to burn it, dissolving its smoky form into nothingness. Within seconds, the shadow was gone. I collapsed to the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the flare gun. The lantern room was a mess: shattered glass, splintered wood, and the remains of the door scattered across the floor. But the light was on. The barrier was restored. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the spot where the shadow had been. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and relief, exhaustion and adrenaline. I'd survived. But for how long? The shadow was gone, but the lights on the water were still out there. And the voice on the radio. It had warned me. You shouldn't have done that. As the first rays of dawn broke through the fog, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. The lighthouse was a prison, and I was its unwilling keeper. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew I couldn't fight it. Not alone. I packed my things and left the lighthouse, the keys still hanging from the hook by the door. I didn't look back as I walked down the rocky path to the shore. The fog had lifted, and the ocean was calm, its surface reflecting the pale light of the rising sun. I climbed into the small rowboat tied to the dock and started rowing, my eyes fixed on the horizon. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I would do next. But I knew one thing for certain. I was never going back to that lighthouse. As I rowed away, I thought I heard it. A faint, distant sound carried on the wind. It might have been the foghorn, or it might have been something else. I didn't look back to find out.